and welcome to History Made Simply, your one-stop history hop back in time, where each week we'll be uncovering history's secrets for you. Make sure to like this episode and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for weekly History Made Simply episodes. On today's episode, we're recounting the final days of one of British history's most tragic figures, Mary, Queen of Scots. Known for her bitter rivalry with her cousin, the English Queen Elizabeth I, Mary inherited her father's throne when she was just a baby, but after the loss of 3 husbands and a Scottish crown, she would lose her head to an incident filled with all the flair and turmoil she so famously lived in. Let's take a look at the absolutely chaotic execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. So let's set up just how Queen Mary I of Scotland ended up on the English scaffold. And guys, it was not with a series of well thought out decisions. Mary's march down the primrose path of doom could be said to have begun on the day she was born, if we're being honest. She arrived on December the 8th, 1542, as the only surviving legitimate child of King James V of Scotland and his second wife, French noblewoman Mary de Guise. Her father was not on hand to witness her delivery, however, as he had been out fighting with the forces of his uncle, King Henry VIII of England since November. Henry, who had broken with the Catholic Church by this time, was furious that his sister's son would not tolerate his new religious policies and launch a major raid into southwest Scotland. The English crushed the Scots in the resulting Battle of Solway Moss, and James died in his sickbed from drinking contaminated water while on the campaign, just 6 days after his daughter's birth. An infant queen with a foreign mother as her regent left Scotland more vulnerable than ever, and King Henry increased his military aggression with a new tactic: to subdue Scotland and have little Mary married off to his young son, Prince Edward Tuda, in a new series of conflicts that became known as the Rough Wooing. Seems like we're already off to a great start here. To subvert these attacks, Mary was instead shipped off to France and betrothed to Dauphin Francis, eldest son and heir of King Henry II. There will be a lot of Henrys in this story, so please be prepared. Mary would grow up in France in expectation of this marriage, which took place in April 1558, with the bride and groom were only about 15. It was at this time, at the French court, however, that would really hurt her chances at ruling Scotland when it came to it, as Francis would die barely a year after ascending the French throne, and Mary, now aged 18 and having had no children by her deceased husband, was obliged in the summer of 1561 to return to her homeland that to her was basically a foreign country, where her Catholicism, preference for the French language, her continental mannerisms and absolutist style of rule put her directly at odds with her majority Protestant Scottish subjects, who, under the leadership of her illegitimate half-brother, the Earl of Moray, had the run of the place during the years Mary spent in France. By comparison, with her stint as King Francis's consort, Mary felt she had fallen decidedly down the pecking order of early modern Europe as the ruler of the top half of an isolated, poor and often war-torn island, and her commitment to reign as a devout Catholic monarch over a largely Protestant country did nothing to quell the tensions mounting within the Queen and her kingdom. So what did Mary do? Mary, her idiotic cousin Henry Stewart, Lord Darnley, himself a member of the extended Tudor royal family, to combine their claims and annoy her other cousin Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII, and by this time Queen of England, over the famously unmarried and childless Queen's refusal to name Mary as her official successor. Mary packed off the drunken disorderly Darnley to one of his country estates, where he promptly fell ill. She coaxed him back to Edinburgh so he could recuperate, and after visiting him and informing him of the birth of their child, Mary left for a wedding, and that night, February 10th, 1567, Darnley's bedroom exploded, but found strangled in the garden instead of being blown up to smithereens. Henry Darnley's suspicious death, and Mary's even more suspiciously swift marriage to her third husband, the Earl of Bothwell, accused of foul play alongside her, within a matter of weeks of this whole thing, caused such an uproar that the Queen, who had always seemed more French than she was Scottish, was forced to abdicate her throne that spring, in favour of her and Darnley's infant son, who was now declared King James VI of Scotland in her place. This devastating sequence of events was no doubt sparked by Mary's complete lack of political savvy, coupled with her obsession over her possible rulership of England, which distracted her from the now proven fatal problems in the country that she did rule. Crownless and husbandless, as Bothwell fled abroad to save his own skin, she managed to escape her subsequent imprisonment, but then made another huge mistake by fleeing across the border to England to seek succour from Elizabeth. Yes, Elizabeth, the woman whose rule she repeatedly undermined, with Darnley no less, and had even refused to officially recognise back when Mary was still in France. This couldn't possibly go wrong. And wrong it did, though not as fast as you might think, given Mary's track record. To Mary's relief, Elizabeth did receive her, but then proceeded to keep her chaotic cousin under stylish house arrest for the next 19 years. Though she was constantly spied on, Mary was treated as an exiled ruler and royal guest, equipped with her own household, chock full of servants, and all the luxuries that befitted her queenly rank. Mary dined repeatedly on 100 courses every night served on silver plates, was allowed to roam and ride freely on the various manors she was lodged, and even went to Buxton with the entirety of her expensive wardrobe for her annual spa dates. Mainly because 2 decades of lounging around the house and grooming herself on lavish delicacies had caused the increasingly overweight former queen to develop rheumatoid arthritis. But Mary eventually decided these quiet country comforts just would not do, and over the years involved herself in plan after plan to have Elizabeth I at best dethroned, or at worst assassinated, so Mary could get her hands on the English crown she thought was rightfully hers, since she had such great success holding on to the ones of Scotland and France. The scheme that sealed Mary's fate and greatly pleased the man behind it all, Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's principal secretary, who spent the better part of 20 years trying to convince his queen to kill this woman, was the infamous Babington Plot of 1586. Now, it's not like Mary didn't have a point about her place in the English succession. Henry VIII's colourful marriage career clouded the claims of his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth Tuda, who succeeded their brother King Edward VI when he died an unmarried teenager in the summer of 1556. Yeah, the same guy they tried to wed Mary off to when she was a baby. Both girls were declared illegitimate while Henry was busy divorcing and beheading their mothers respectively, and though he later restored them to the royal line behind their legitimate baby brother in his will, he never changed his legal status. Edward even tried to use his technicality in one final shot against his eldest sister, with whom relations had gone south at the time of his death, by cutting them both out of the succession in favour of their cousin, Lady Jane Grey. For 9 days, young Jane and her faction tried frantically to hang on to power until the Tudor sisters successfully marched on London and Mary I took charge, married her mother's great-nephew King Philip II of Spain, burnt a bunch of Protestants. Edward may have had a point about not wanting her on the throne, and ruled for only 5 years before dying without children, thus allowing her Protestant sister Elizabeth to take over as queen. The Gregor's forceful Protestantism was what made her an attractive candidate to Edward, who was an ardent adherent of his father's Reformation and was terrified of his eldest sister undoing all of that by returning England to Catholicism, which she feverishly tried to do, as we've seen. But in terms of the dynasty, Jane had an inferior right as a descendant of Henry VIII's younger sister, yet another Mary. But if that king's only surviving children were legally illegitimate, then the succession by rights indeed belonged to Scottish Mary Stewart, as the granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's older sister. Mary took advantage of the murkiness by displaying the English royal emblems in her official coat of arms during her time as the Dauphine of France, which, to be fair, was urged on by her equally unstable and devotedly Catholic father-in-law, Henry II, who was no friend of Protestant England and jumped at the chance of Mary, and therefore his son, inheriting a throne that came with England and Ireland as well as Mary's Scotland. France would clean house. As we now know, this would never be the case, and French Henry would later die horrifically in a disastrous jousting accident. Mary only dropped the emblems after sustained diplomatic pressure from an incensed Elizabeth, but her determination to make good her claim to be England's queen, her fervent Catholicism, the fact that she had already produced a male heir, and her undoubted legitimacy made her an attractive alternative for Elizabeth's detractors. Enter Anthony Babington, a young recusant recruited by the Jesuit priest John Ballard, who hoped to rescue the Scottish Queen and replace Elizabeth I with her, thus restoring England to the true faith. Our prospect, our boarded and imprisoned Mary Stewart found too tempting to resist. Unfortunately for them, their ragtag team of accomplices was infiltrated by double agents loyal to the conniving Walsingham, who managed to decode the messages passed between Mary and her co-conspirators. After this long confinement, Elizabeth may have thought her cousin harmless, but she found herself troubled by the increasing tensions in traditionally Catholic Ireland and militant Catholic residents at home, spurred on by hostilities pouring out of Rome, particularly from Pope Pius V, who declared her a heretic and even issued a papal bull to excommunicate her back in 1567, calling Elizabeth, the pretend Queen of England, the servant of wickedness, laughable since she was never a member of His Holiness's church. What wasn't funny though was that the bull supposedly released English Catholics from any oaths of allegiance to the Tudor Queen and called upon them to remove her from the throne. As an act of devout Christian charity, of course. So, Mary's sudden flurry of communication with a pair of religious extremists set off the alarm bells for Swinemaster Walsingham, who had set everything up so that Mary, in effect, signed her own death warrant when she replied enthusiastically to the plotters. And for those of William Cecil, another of Elizabeth's top advisor and Mary's top haters, bells must have been rung even louder when it was discovered that Mary planned to achieve her prospective comeback by the solicitation of a Spanish invasion of England. Remember, their king at the time was Philip II, the widower of Elizabeth's dead sister Mary, and conveniently another of the English Queen's arch nemesises. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, it seemed. The French too were implicated in Mary's plan. She was their former Queen Consort and half French herself, if you recall. And faced with this mountain of evidence, Elizabeth finally had Mary arrested. In October 1586, Mary Stewart was sent on a 4-day journey to Northamptonshire to be tried at Fotheringhay Castle, where she protested being denied the opportunity to review the evidence, the confiscation of her papers, that she was denied access to legal counsel and was not allowed to call upon any witness. The proceedings were held in the castle's great chamber, where an empty throne represented Queen Elizabeth and Mary was seated in a subordinate position. Mary denied knowing Babington and Ballard, of course, and questioned the court's ability to try her since she was anointed queen of a foreign country. But like the B-Boys and the rest of the Kill the Queen Club, she was convicted of treason and sentenced to death. Convicting a queen was one thing, but killing her was quite another. In fact, Elizabeth hesitated to order Mary's execution for weeks, even in the face of pressure from her own parliament to carry out the sentence. She was concerned that the execution of one queen by another would set a dangerous precedent and was fearful of the consequences, especially if Mary's son James formed an alliance with the likes of Spain and France, who had always preferred the Stuart Queen and invaded England to avenge Mary. As it happened though, Elizabeth's fears about King James VI were unfounded, though he did instruct his diplomats to try to stay his mother's execution and even back the efforts of King Henry III, one of Mary's former brother-in-laws. When the French king sent his Lord Chancellor to London in November 1586 to plead for her life, James, however, was understandably not greatly attached to a mother who last saw him when he was less than a year old, a mother he therefore had no memory of nor any affection for. He even signed the Treaty of Berwick with Elizabeth that same year, perhaps motivated by the chance, with his mother now soon out of the way, to inherit England upon the Tudor Queen's death. Elizabeth, for her part, even went so far as to suggest to Mary's final custodian that if he would contrive a clandestine way to shorten the life of Mary, which he refused to do because he would not make a shipwreck of my conscience, or leave so great a blot on my poor posterity. So, on February 1st, 1587, with no other option, Elizabeth signed the death warrant, and just a few days later, 10 members of the Privy Council, having been summoned by an overeager William Cecil without Elizabeth's knowledge or consent, decided to carry out the long-awaited sentence at once, and on the evening of February 7th, Mary was told she was to be executed the next morning. She spent the last hours of her life in prayer, distributing her belongings among what was left of her household servants, and sitting down. In the very early hours of February 8th, she composed her will and wrote what would be her very last letter, addressed to the King of France in hopes that he might be able to settle some of her financial affairs after she was gone. In it, Mary spoke of the confiscation of her papers and her inability to have them returned to her so that she might take care of some of her personal matters, and she requested that Henry pay her servants the money owed them out of the good Christian charity in his own heart. Mary also complained that her chaplain had been sent away from her, thus preventing him from hearing her confession or giving her the last sacrament. It seems Edward VI wasn't the only Tudor with a penchant for firing off last shots. In the face of this Protestant petulance, however, Mary did not waver in her confession of the Catholic faith and maintained her innocence. Rather incorrectly, in the 2 points in which she is believed she was convicted, her Catholic faith and her God-given right to the English throne. She pointed out that, even if she was subject of English law, she would not be guilty of any crime. Drama-fueled delusion, even at death's door. Finally, Mary requested that her body be conveyed to France, where she wished to be buried, and lamented to Henry that her request was denied by Queen Elizabeth. A scaffold was erected in the Great Hall at Fotheringhay, where Mary was tried and was draped in a black cloth and furnished with a block, of course, a cushion for Mary to kneel on, and 3 stools for her and the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent, there to officially witness the sentence. The executioner and his assistant knelt before the former queen and asked her for forgiveness, following the typical practice for executioners to request pardons from the ones being put to death. Mary replied, "I forgive you with all my heart, for now, I hope, you shall make an end of all my troubles." Mary was not beheaded with a single strike. The first blow missed her neck and struck the back of her head, causing her and the onlookers to scream in terror. The second blow severed the neck, save for a tiny bit of sinew, which the executioner had to slice through with the axe. Afterwards, he held up the severed head and declared, "God save the Queen." It is said that at that moment, the auburn curls in his bloody hand turned out to be a wig, which detached from the head, causing it to fall to the ground and roll towards the horrified crowd, who gasped to see that the lustrous hair Mary was known for in her youth was now very short and grey. Cecil's nephew, who had a front row seat to this catastrophe of an execution, reported to his uncle that after the Queen's death, her lips stirred up and down a quarter of an hour after her head was cut off, apparently repeating her last words, "In manus tuis Domini commendo spiritum meum, into my hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." Mary's pet dog then chose this moment to emerge from where it had been hiding among her skirts and mid-chaos launch itself into the now reeling, raucous gathering. The scaffold, weapon, block and everything else that had touched the dead Queen's blood were quickly burnt to deter relic hunters eager to buy into Mary's roleplay at martyrdom. When the news of the execution reached Elizabeth, she became indignant and asserted that Davison, to whom she'd entrusted Mary's death warrant, had disobeyed her instructions, and that those 10 privy councillors Cecil summoned had acted without her authority. Elizabeth's vacillation and deliberately vague instructions did, cunningly, give her plausible deniability in her attempt to wash her hands of the direct stain of her Scottish cousin's blood. Davison was arrested, thrown into the Tower of London and found guilty of misprision or the wrong performance of an official duty. He was released after 19 months when Cecil and Walsingham interceded on his behalf. Elizabeth even wrote to King James apologising for the death of his mother and placing the blame for the whole sorry show squarely on the shoulders of her privy councillors. Way to go, Queenie! Mary's request to be buried in France was refused by Elizabeth, as we've covered, and her body was instead embalmed and left in a secure lead coffin until her burial in a Protestant service at Peterborough Cathedral in July 1587. Her entrails, removed as a part of the embalming process, were buried secretly within Fotheringhay Castle, where her chaotic life finally came to its dramatic end. Elizabeth had always believed that executing Mary would lead to bigger problems, such as an international backlash, which is why she held off executing her for so long. But as it turned out, the consequences were not as serious as Elizabeth had feared. The French, for instance, who were probably Mary's most dedicated supporters, wanted to maintain their alliance with England as a counterweight to growing Spanish aggression on their shared border, and so did not react forcefully to the news of Mary's permanent removal, Despite papal provocations, English Catholics remained largely loyal to Elizabeth after Mary's downfall, and Scotland, whose king had his eye on Elizabeth's throne, was now one step closer to it, also took no action. Surprisingly enough, in the Holy Roman Empire, multiple news pamphlets were published on her execution, which all followed a similar formula: a brief explanation of why Mary had sought refuge in England, followed by reasons for her execution, and concluding with a detailed description of the dramatic day of her death. Suffice it to say that Mary Stewart was a tragic failure of a queen who was unable to cope with the demands her rank placed on her, but her remarkable courage at her chaotic execution helped establish her popular image as a heroic victim in a dramatic tragedy. Like we touched on earlier, Mary was initially buried at Peterborough Cathedral, but was moved to Westminster Abbey 9 years after her son accomplished what she had deluded herself into trying to achieve for so many years. When King James VI of Scotland took the English throne as King James I, following the death of Elizabeth in 1603, finally uniting all of Britain under a single monarch. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the chaotic execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, from History Made Simply. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel and watch our next episode.